So today's class we'll see about UiPath logging. So what exactly these UiPath logs are, and what is the configuration we set up to an orchestrator level, and what kind of logs if you want to monitor at the studio level, and if you want to see at orchestrator level. We'll see how these logs are being controlled and how these are monitored in different ways. First of all, what are the logs? So these logs are kind of an timestamped files, right? So what kind of an information usually contain is, say, if you have an event-based logs or any errors or the warnings or messages which is specific or relevant to an application. So not only an UiPath, so any kind of an application does contain these kind of an information which is pertaining to specific set of events. Say the events can be while launching an application, or the application crashes, or at any point of time, right? So different set of an events bound to happen. Or you want to see or monitor what kind of an errors or warning messages, right, which are specific to applications. So these logs can help to debug or trace the root cause. In a similar way, we do have a specific set of loggings, right, which is dedicated to UiPath. And coming to different types of logging, so there are robot execution logs, or these logs are the messages which is being generated by the execution of this specific process, and typically it contain the information or behavior of the specific messages. So these kind of an execution logs we can generate through the write line or using your log message activity. And coming to another set of an attribute of the logs is a default message of system generated logs. So these system generated logs are generated by default. So when the execution of some project happens, so the from the point of an execution where the project starts and ends, if any system error occurs and the execution stop, or when the logging settings, so these kind of logs are being tracked, and that is system generated logs. Say these are configured in such a way, whenever the execution happens, right from the point of an trigger to the point of an completion, every set of an activities are being logged. So when I say the different events logged by this category, it can be execution start. So what happens is, whenever there is a start in execution of the process, it generate every time the moment when the process is started. And coming to the next set of an execution log, which is execution end. So execution end is generated every time when the process is finalized. Coming to a transaction start. So once, say you have in your executions and project execution, where you have an n number of transactions in a transactional framework, at every point of a transaction, that means if you have an n number of transactions at the start of an every transaction, when the process is started, the transaction going to get triggered. In the similar way, transaction end, it is being generated every time when the transaction within a process is finalized. And coming to error logs. Error logs are something which generated every time when any execution encounters any error and the process getting aborted, right? Or uninterrupted stops, right? So error logs gonna generate. And debugging, there is other set of log called debugging logs. So debugging logs are generated. We do have an robot logging settings. So depending on type of and value which is set to this attribute, so this typically contains verbose and trace information, critical, warning, and these kind of an attributes are set up. So depending on this, the debugging logs are set up, right? And coming to, as I defined before, these are all the logs which we have just read. These are all default logs or the system generated logs. Then coming to the next set of categories, user generated logs. How these user generated logs are generated is the process which we define in the UI. So either we can generate this by using a log message activity or write line activity. So this is what the orchestrator logging hierarchy. I'm going to show you in a minute. Once you open your system tray, under your UiPath assistant, right click and you do see orchestrator settings, right? When I say these orchestrator settings, so you can see all your logs being, we can read in the console. However, in the real-time environment, you don't, for unattended bots, right, for scheduled bots, you don't know what's happening, or you can't track what is the logging level at the studio level because you don't have an access to it. So if you go into a real-time production environment, usually you monitor these logs through Kibana, Elasticsearch. So where, as I told you in the initial architecture as well, always there is a synchronization between your studio and an orchestrator. So wherever this bot runs, all these event logs has been captured to the Kibana. Again, Kibana is a log monitoring tool where effectively we can, that's kind of an monitoring tool where you can see and keep track of all the logs which is being generated, and we can see what is the process state, whether it is a success or failure. At every point of an execution, we can keep track of those logs. So coming to an orchestrator, right? First thing what we need to check is, check under these orchestrator settings, what is the logging level it has been set to, right? So by default, as I told you, these are all the different types of log levels where we can put down in our project. So by default, it is set to information, but we need to understand what are all these different logging levels and what differs for each of these logging levels. Let me start with the trace. So trace logs are basically for the developers or testers. It enables us to actually see at what point or activity the process threw an exception. Say you're trying to develop or you want to test this project. Say at particular point of an in the runtime, some activity is faulting out, or some initialization is faulting out. So you want to see critical at what point of the process through an exception. So the trace logs will help you to put at this level. Whereas coming to information is logging anything ranging from what you want to convey or capture in the logs. Say it can be other than the errors or warning, which will be obviously logged in the information, which is turned out to the robot. And coming to verbose, see, on the topmost level, we have an verbose. Verbose is something which is, if you want to keep a track of each start and end of in each activity and the variables and the argument level, I mean, the arguments on the transaction level information. All this information can be tracked under the verbose. Normally, in the real time, we usually keep this logging level to info, debug, or error while developing an application. But UiPath has designed this in such a way to have a more controlling feature on what you want to see in an orchestrator, right? Say, for example, these slides, when you look at this slide, so the orchestrator logging hierarchy is, if we set the logging level to information, so all the logs which is down underneath this thing in the level in the hierarchy, you will see everything. Say if you set to information, you will see warning, error, and critical. If you set to the topmost level, right? Say for an instance, you put down to trace, then including the trace, everything including these above this level, we'll see down, right? So by default, it's set to information. If you set orchestrator configuration to error, then any logs which is of info and trace cannot be found. So always try to remember this is your level in the hierarchy. I will show you in an orchestrator how these logs are being set and how we can see these different levels of configuration. And if you want to see what is my orchestrator URL, so if you go to configuration settings, so orchestrator URL by default, the updated one is https://cloud.uipath.com. When I go to my default orchestrator services, so this is how the console. We're going to discuss everything in detail when the deployment classes comes up, but I just want to show you. Say when you go to the section jobs, let me try to run a sample job and I will try to demonstrate this process. So I have triggered a specific and manually I triggered one job, right? So currently one job is running. Okay, now that the process, it has been finished this process, I would like to know the end state of this job. It shows as success. However, if I want to go into detail and see what kind of logs has been generated, right? Once you click this specific process, on the top you see the level. So as you have seen in this, what are the different levels? Trace, info, warn, error, and fatal. So these are all the different logs. Usually when we develop our application, we set these logging levels, right? Say for an instance, when I launch this process, I set as an info message, and info message I am set this as an info. That means at this level of information, the log gonna mark as a level as an info. Say if you want to talk me about the real-time process, real-time case use case, say you have an n number of transactions to process, out of which if you get any invalid material numbers, we are logging as an one, and on the top of it you are triggering an exception mail or categorizing this as an rule exception. In this case, what you will do, say you can mark this as an invalid material number or invalid transaction to process, right? So by looking at the logs, you can know what happened to the specific set of a transaction. In that case, once you log this message, you can either put down as an one or info. So depending on your specific set of requirements, we can differentiate out this kind of logs. So that's on the logging levels. I will try to demonstrate you on the each case. So let me go to the slides, and the first slide says that what exactly the logs are about. So always there is a synchronization, as I told you, between this orchestrator and your studio. So if in case your orchestrator is not available, and if you have a just standalone studio, then the logs are stored on your local DB. So the local DB is where your app data, UiPath is there. Over there you have an execution log data file, right? So until the connection is re-established or when it is restored, again these logs are sent in the batches which it has been generated. And second slide says what are the default logs, the system generated logs, and the user defined logs. And as we have seen, the orchestrator settings, where usually they will ask you a question in the interviews like how we can change the robot logging configuration. So that can be done through your system tray. Go back to your agent and right click and change under your orchestrator settings. Under orchestrator settings, you can change your logging level. Another question which they might put up is what is the level of hierarchy which the robot logging can happen, and what are the different levels we can set it to. So verbose, trace, info, warn, error, and critical and all. So that's what this slide says, where exactly the execution logs and where we set this and how we control this. And this slide says about the hierarchy. And let me expand this. See, if you set to verbose logging level, so what exactly the logs are logged? So the activities, as you can see, an example within XML, the activities are being logged in the verbose, and I told you all the variables and then arguments, properties of an arguments are being logged at the verbose level. And coming to the trace, you can see all set of an activities are logged. And coming to info, in your project, what are all the logs you put down under your log message activity or write line? All these are being tracked under information. And warnings, yes, warnings. If you select the warning as a level, so this can be logged. So this is a sheet where it says if we say off, it is not applicable.